My name is Kelly Lasseter, and today I am presenting my ECE Capstone exhibition on inclusionary practices for students with autism spectrum disorder in the general education setting. I want to start off by telling you a little bit about myself. I am currently a third grade teacher at Danielsville Elementary School in the Madison County School District. I have taught for 7 years with 11 years total experience as I was a paraprofessional before becoming an educator. I also have a son with an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, which gives me a unique perspective as being both a teacher of students with ASC and a parent as well. So I want to start off by talking about inclusion. So Paula Cluth, the author of You're Gonna Love This Kid, teaching students with autism spectrum disorder in the inclusive classroom. She defines inclusion as an educational orientation that meets the needs of all learners. And that's the basis of my philosophy. Throughout my courses at Piedmont College, I've learned about school law, current trends, lots of different things within my classes that's helped me develop a inclusionary practice that meets the needs of all of my learners, and specifically learning supports for students with autism spectrum disorder as well. So inclusion has both a social and political foundation. The most important aspect of inclusion is that it moves beyond strategies and practices and builds upon the uniqueness of the student within your classroom. So Temple Grandin, who is a autism advocate, who has an autism diagnosis herself and a leading engineer in science as well, says there needs to be more emphasis on what a child can do instead of what they cannot do. So that's the basis of inclusion, is building up students and building upon their strengths and supporting them when they have challenges. So why do we need inclusionary practice? For many reasons, it's mandated, and there are educational laws that influence student access to education. So throughout my course at Piedmont College regarding school law, I learned about Brown versus Board of Education, which is a case that was centered around school segregation, having equal access to education regardless of your race. But that beginning legislation paved the way for cases like Mills versus the Board of Education of DC and Park versus the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, where families built upon that case in order to have equal access to education for their children with special needs. So learning a little bit of background about how educational laws have developed for students with special needs has really helped me understand and develop my inclusionary practices. So relevant research and resources. There are lots of resources out there, websites, books, scholarly studies that I have read over the course of my studies at Piedmont. One of my greatest resources is the book called You're Gonna Love This Kid, what I quoted just a moment ago. It is full of resources, assessments, everything you need to know about supporting students with autism within your inclusionary general education setting. So one study that particularly kind of struck me in helping me develop my inclusionary practices was the study in 2015 by Tassim Talib and Sharon Paulson, where they said because students with autism often have different educational needs, it's important for general educators to develop an understanding of the students in ways so that they can appropriately accommodate them in their classrooms. And this is true for all students with special needs or students of all abilities, whether you're on grade level, below grade level, advanced, have a diagnosis, do not have a diagnosis. Learning your students and getting to know them is the key to inclusionary practice. So other relevant studies throughout my courses and through my research have just talked about how inclusionary practice build relationships, social emotional learning, self-advocacy, and just supporting student differences and different abilities within your classroom, and and also their academic success as well. So my personal pedagogy is centered around the words that I've listed on the screen: respect, self-advocacy, support, accountability, creating a democratic and fair classroom, and collaboration. And that's collaborative learning between students, between my administration, between my colleagues, just learning how to develop a classroom that provides a positive and inclusive learning environment. I believe it's my responsibility as well as the responsibilities of the students to to celebrate diversity and create, it's my job to create opportunities that enrich children's lives and celebrate their unique strengths and build upon areas in which they need to grow. It's imperative for my students to take ownership of their classroom, to be free of anxiety, and to be open to learning and accepting new ideas. And my ultimate goal in my pedagogy is to foster academic growth, but to also celebrate and foster social emotional growth that they can apply to their everyday lives. So when the students leave my classroom or they leave Danielsville Elementary School and move on, that they can take the social emotional growth, celebration of diversity, all those things, and be able to honor each other in differences, respect each other, self-advocate for yourself, hold yourself accountable, hold others accountable, and be able to, become an all-around complete, success in all aspects of your learning. For inclusion, the most important thing for me is it's the right thing for boys and girls. Being able to help students grow in their own self-confidence, in their abilities, supporting students in ways that don't single them out, but are inclusive, that help them fit in and shine within my classroom. So, understanding autism. According to a 2020 study conducted by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, approximately 1 in 54 students are diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder before age 4. So this means that there are more than 500,000 students within the public education system in the United States. So common things that you see with students with autism is they can have deficits in social communication, they can have specialized interests, restrictive and repetitive behaviors, and sensory differences. Those are a lot of the what they use to diagnose students, the criteria for diagnoses and all. So throughout my autism endorsement, I've really developed an understanding of how autism is diagnosed and how those characteristics influence education and learning with those students. So some students with ASD are nonverbal. They have limited speech. So you might be working and collaborating with students that need speech therapy and occupational therapy. They may need picture schedules. So you will constantly within your classroom be adapting to meet their needs. Specifically, one thing that I learned through my experience, one of my field experiences, I had an opportunity to observe a child using assistive technology to communicate, which is what the arrow is pointing to, the iPad. He had an iPad, it had pictures, and he was nonverbal, but through using this device, the teacher told me that they learned that they thought the student was unable to read, didn't have decoding skills, didn't have phonics skills, could not read at any level. Well, they started working with the assistive technology, and it wasn't that the student could not read, the student just didn't have a voice to talk and tell them about what they were reading. And they found that the student was actually reading above grade level. They just had no way of assessing the student So it gave the student a voice, which is very powerful. And it was a pleasure to be able to see that. And throughout my classroom, I have visual supports for students that are English language learners, for students that are have autism, have different learning abilities. So it's easy to incorporate pictures and things, and teaching students about, if a student has assistive technology, teaching them how that helps them learn in a different way, so that no one's singled out, and that it is a tool for learning. So that was very exciting for me to see that experience. Another aspect for ASC is that those students with ASC may have trouble reading social cues and body language. Deficits can help it kind of make it difficult for communication, and can have an effect on peer relationships as well. So when you're building a collaborative classroom, it's sometimes difficult for peers to understand the differences for students with autism spectrum disorder. So for me, I like to use morning meetings to talk about how we can, support social cues. So one game that's you can play during morning meeting is just an emotions task card, putting up a picture like the one of the girl here, and just asking, what is the child, what is the girl feeling? Why do you think she's feeling this way? And that helps students learn empathy. It helps them read social cues. And for me in my third grade classroom, a lot of my students need those skills. So it's a good way to promote learning for social cues and strategies to support those deficits that students with ASC may have, but also help support all students within your classroom. So some students with ASC have communication differences. We talked a little bit about that, or I talked a little bit about that with the assistive technology. But particularly for my students with ASC that I've seen in my classroom, and with my son as well, is that they may avoid eye contact. They may turn away from conversations or appear to be disengaged. But through my learning and through my courses, I've learned, and through my experience with my son and teaching, that looking away or lack of eye contact does not mean they're not learning or listening or processing the information. So Dr. Carrie Margot, who is a autism advocate, and he also has an ASC diagnosis, talks a lot about what other people perceive from people who have autism. So we talked about lack of, people oftentimes think students with ASC have a lack of empathy because they don't engage in conversations the same way as they're typically developing peers. So making eye contact and reminding myself that that's uncomfortable for students with ASC, or that it doesn't mean that they're not listening or engaged in the conversation, helps me support my students in my classroom. Some students with ASC need longer periods of time to process and form responses. And this was very, very important for me. As a new teacher, when I first started, you're so rushed as an educator and you're trying to get things done. So I was a come on and give me an answer kind of teacher. So I made myself a poster that says, don't be an I'll wait teacher. So you had that kind of grumpy face, or like, come on, give me the answer. I know you know it. That causes a lot of anxiety for lots of students, particularly those with autism spectrum disorder. So giving students wait time, telling students that you're going to call on them, if you call on one student and telling a student with autism or a student that needs more time to process a response, tell them they're going to be next, and you're going to tell them the question you're going to ask, so you're not surprising them. So the old me was an I'll wait teacher, and through learning and experiences, I learned to develop and give students wait time so that they can appropriately respond, and it reduces anxiety. Some students with autism can have meltdowns. and when communication is difficult. So meltdowns are not temper tantrums. They are an emotional call for help. With students with ASD particularly feel overwhelmed, or they're unable to communicate using language. And that goes back to, the student that I observed in the field experience before having his assistive technology, he would have meltdowns because he simply could not verbalize the things that he wanted to say. So it really gave him a voice to tell others, his wants and needs. And behavior is communication. Using assessment to drive inclusionary practices. And this is one of the key elements to getting to know your students, getting to know your families, and evaluating your school as a whole to know, am I providing the best inclusionary practices within my classroom? So one checklist that I would like to show you here is the is your school inclusive checklist. And this is just a way of assessing your school. So we actually completed this form in my autism advisor class, and I conducted it on my school. It talks about just different practices. For example, do staff develop opportunities to reflect inclusive philosophy? So are you talking about inclusion in your professional development at your schools? Do you have a clear philosophy for developing inclusionary practices for students with autism, for students of all abilities? So just a good way to look at and assess yourself within your classroom, within your school. And also there are assessments and checklists for your families, for for your particular students as well. Supports for the classroom environment. It's very important to develop a classroom environment where students can move if they need to move. They can, they are comfortable. Lots of students with autism spectrum disorder have, they may need to move in certain ways. They might have repetitive movements that they need to be able to do during the class. So these are some of the things that I have implemented in my classroom. I have kick bands, which are for foot movement, wobble stools. I have places where you can sit on the floor, you can sit on carpet. I have lowered tables, standing tables. So it gives students the opportunity to be flexible in their seating, and they can adapt and kind of learn what's best for them in my classroom. So definitely using that. Also, I provide sensory supports. Again, you can do a sensory profile assessment through checklists, but learning how to adapt to my students' sensory needs has really helped. And this particular picture of the boy, where we were doing an science experiment, and it was noisy, and my classroom is noisy, and that I can kind of tune it out. But for some of my students with ASD, some of my students without ASD, it's hard to concentrate during kind of noisy and kind of loud activities. So they all have earbuds for using Chromebooks. So a lot of times they'll pop those in to kind of filter out some of the noise, and noise canceling headphones as well, using aromatherapies, using light filters. Chewing gum can help with sensory supports as well. Social emotional supports for my classroom. This is one of my favorite parts of teaching. Particularly one thing that I've implemented in the last few years and learned about through just professional development and through my courses at Piedmont is using whole brain learning strategies and rules, using mirrors, which is modeling and repeated directions, having students repeat back directions to me, using a call and response to get attention, the class's attention, rather than calling out a single student. But just developing a classroom where the students are teaching each other, they're modeling for each other, I'm modeling. So it's very much, we all take some responsibility in the procedures of our classroom. I also am doing more research on growth mindsets, particularly for students with autism, and the responsive classroom. And responsive classroom is where I conduct a lot of morning meetings, or we have just little class discussions and that are directly related to a need in our classroom. So if we are trying to understand why one student has an iPad to help them with writing and one student doesn't, we'll have a morning meeting about how we're different, how we learned in different ways, and what works for one student may not work for another. Talking about our emotions and our feelings, and really creating an atmosphere of understanding and problem solving. I'm also a member of the PBIS team at my school, which is great because I feel like I can now that I've developed an understanding of autism and inclusionary practice, I can bring that to my meeting, and we can hopefully, discuss those things during our PBIS in our school, just to kind of help support students throughout our school, not just in my classroom. So I'm very excited about that. And through my autism classroom, I also developed a professional learning proposal that I hope to share with some of the members of my PBIS team, just different ways to support students with autism. Co-teaching and collaboration. This is my co-teaching and general education team for my school. We are a great team. I'm very, very privileged to work with ladies who are open to inclusion and collaboration. By developing that philosophy, I have really focused on working with my co-teacher, making sure that we have common goals and objectives. Collaborative planning. You cannot have inclusionary practices work if you're not planning and working with your students and with teachers and your team. Recognizing and supporting when I have a weakness in one area and my co-teacher has a strength, learning how to adapt our styles to support our students. Positive communication is a must, and putting students first. So if we're putting student needs first, the rest of those things really just fall into place, and it's just such a blessing to be able to work with such a great team that puts co-teaching and collaboration at the forefront for our students. Parent-teacher relationships. So building relationships with family is very important. Fostering positive communication with parents. That goes back to needs assessment, telling parents how their students are doing, telling them where their struggles are, making sure that you are providing positive communication as well as feedback on things areas of growth. It really is so helpful for students with ASD and all students. Particularly one experience I have for my son is he is a struggling writer. He's always struggled with work completion. So talking with his teachers about his special interests, he loves technology, and how to incorporate technology into his work has really helped him to be able to grow in those areas where he struggles. And I've seen the same thing for students within my classroom. If I have a student that has a special interest, then I try to incorporate those into my classroom activities. And the greatest expert on a child with ASD or on any child is their parents. So definitely building that relationship where parents feel safe to share with you and they feel supported by you is very, very important in your inclusionary practices. So my personal implications in practice, again, just supporting self-advocacy, helping myself and my colleagues learn how to support students with ASD as well as all students within your classroom, and working to resolve misconceptions for ASD, and that will help foster inclusionary practices as well. So just the quote that I always remember from Temple Grandin is, "I am different, not less." And that applies to all students, whether you're a struggling learner or you're an accelerated learner. You're different, not less. And we value the whole child and everything that they have to offer in our classrooms. So thank you so much for being part of my Capstone exhibition. If you have any questions, I will see you on Thursday at 2 o'clock during my question and answer session. Thank you.